The vast majority of manuscripts of, well, any work that we have, we don't know, and we have to speculate about the nature of the manuscript from which the manuscript we possess was copied. We might have it somewhere, but in the vast majority of instances, we don't. That's the nature of antiquity. That's the nature of having ancient texts, is that you don't have, did I move it? Yeah, they're down here. I have a bunch of editions of The Kingdom of the Cults by Walter Martin. And that's because I had to check editing and changes over time when something was introduced or something was taken out, whatever it might be. If you've read The Potter's Freedom, you know that I tried to trace back some of Geisler's development in his thought, especially about foreknowingly predetermining and predeterminately foreknowing and strange language like that. And so even as I was writing the book, I went online and bought, which was sort of tough back then. Online wasn't nearly what it is now. I went back and checked edits, and I literally ended up with, the first printing, first edition, second printing, second, that whole type of thing. That's easy, well, relatively easy to do today, but that's all modern. And one of the biggest dangers in doing textual criticism and explaining textual criticism to others, that's where I get into trouble, is textual critics generally don't try to explain what they're doing to everybody else. They just sort of let that go. I think that's an important thing to do in these days when these issues are being brought up regularly in our witnessing encounters and things like that. So anyway, when you think about the vast majority of manuscripts, wouldn't it be wonderful if we, for example, had the manuscript that was the primary source of the readings of Codex Sinaiticus? Or were there multiple manuscripts? Obviously, Old Testament, New Testament, things like that. My own project with P45, one of the issues there is that it seems rather clear that the scribe had access to multiple manuscripts of differing character from which to draw in producing his own manuscript. And so the result of the fact that there's been lots of wars and fires and bugs and plagues and everything else since the time of the writing of the New Testament, the manuscripts we have, certainly more than any other work of antiquity, but still it is an interrupted transmission. So here's this article that comes up, Scribal Habits in Copies with Extant Exemplars. In other words, what if we do know what manuscript was being copied by hand? And if we possess both and we examine them together, what can we learn about scribal habits? Because, in 99% of the manuscripts, we're having to theorize what the nature of the exemplar, the thing being copied, actually was based upon our observation of scribal habits. Well, if you actually can find what they were copying, now you can go, what were the scribal habits? Not theorize, but actually go, all right, how'd they do it? How well did they do? And what's really interesting is there are a number of things coming up, and this is the nature, this is the proper nature, this is a really interesting thing. This is where I have a real problem with traditionalistic individuals when it comes to the examination of the New Testament. Just go with the 1550 Stephanos or whatever it is. the appropriate way of approaching the growing amount of information available to us, and it is growing, even if we're not necessarily finding a bunch of new manuscripts every year, the information in the manuscripts that we've possessed for a long time is becoming more and more readily available to a wider and wider audience. It used to be just on microfilm. Now, digital copies are showing up all over the place. By the way, for those of you with Accordance, as I use regularly, the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, which we've talked about a couple times, is now available in Accordance. I had wondered when it would be available, and it is available now. And yes, I have it in mind. And right now, I think it's on sale, so it was less than $20. I think I had a $5 credit, so it was like $15. It's really, really, really cheap. Anyway, so what we're supposed to do is, as we have more and more information, then if that information pushes us this direction, for example, the 1881 Westcott and Hort text was imbalanced. There was too much weight put upon Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. And scholarly studies over time, not in a year, real solid scholarship takes time. It takes time to do. It takes time for popularities to be challenged and things like that. Over time, there's been a correction. Well, there's being more of a correction now. CBGM is challenging the very heart and soul of how New Testament textual criticism has been done in challenging the actual existence of text types other than the Byzantine manuscript tradition, Alexandrian, Western, Caesarean, whatever it might be. CBGM is saying, not really. Exactly what's going to come of that yet, because where those are most important is in the Gospels. And our first gospel that'll have CBGM consistently applied to it, at least initially applied to it, probably sometime over the next 4 or 5 years is going to come out, Gospel of Mark. So that's a good thing. It's an appropriate thing. And I just want to remind everyone that basically the more and more information we're getting, the more absurd the arguments of those who say the New Testament has been radically altered become. I mean, even radical skeptics like Bart Ehrman are like, we're just tinkering around, I mean, we pretty much know what it said. There might be a few, he makes a lot of money off the few differences, but as far as the actual message, it's sort of he's moved on to other things. So here is interesting information because, for example, one of the major studies from the end of last century was James Royce's work on singular readings in the New Testament papyri, P45 being one of them, and P75, P66, the major focus that he had. And one of the sort of standard rules of textual criticism is the shorter reading is to be preferred because the theory was scribes would expand rather than contract. They might lose something accidentally, but you had to find something in the text that would have caused that, an error of hearing or more likely an error of sight that would cause homoteleuton or something like that would cause you to skip over something and lose something accidentally. Otherwise, if you have two readings, the one's longer than the other, it's not a parallel passage where the parallel has that would be fairly obvious. There's nothing else. It's where the primary issue is one's longer, one's shorter. There's nothing that necessarily would have caused the scribe to have had an error of sight or hearing or memory or whatever else it might be. Then you prefer the shorter reading. Well, when Royce examined the papyri along those lines, he actually found the opposite. That the tendency was to accidentally lose stuff, not gain stuff. So he actually suggested that the better way would be the longer reading is to be preferred in light of the accidental skipping over of things. So this fellow by the name of Alan Taylor Farnes Alan Taylor Farnes. I had never heard the name. This is going to take a weird twist, by the way, if you're falling asleep. Sorry. But this is going to take a weird twist. And it only took a weird twist in the past 45 minutes for me. Because I brought this article up, and I was going to talk about the fact that Farnes basically looked at this, and he says, I have found that the scribes in this study did their best at a difficult job of copying manuscripts. At no point did I find any example of intentional corruption for theological reasons. Ding, 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 ding. Did you catch that? At no point did I find any example of intentional corruption for theological reasons. The most blatant intentional changes found in this study were the Latin scribes copying 0319 and 0320, who consistently altered the wording from Claromontanist Old Latin to update their text, the Vulgate. Additionally, some of the scribes in this study lost words on the whole, as did Royce's, but other scribes broke even. None of the scribes in this study gained words on the whole. None. Now, let me repeat that. None of the scribes in this study gained words on the whole. Therefore, with respect to the scribes in this study, we can reject the older canon, Lectio Brevior Potior. That is, choose the shorter reading. We are unable, however, to confirm Royce's new canon of Lectio Longior Potior, but rather I caution that length should not be used in any way to determine which reading is more original. Here I add my voice to Stephen Carlson's and Peter Malik's that length is not a valuable metric for determining which reading is more original. Well, that right there is important. That right there is very interesting. And if you're sitting there, and most of us have, for example, Metzger's commentary on the Greek New Testament in our Accordance or Logos or Bible Works or Olive Tree. I try to remember all of them because they're all great folks and I appreciate what they're doing. In your setup, I'm sure it's available in all of them, you will see that the committee that initially anyways put together the UBS text, the older Nestle-Aland text, there's a couple of places where the shorter reading prevails because the assumption was the shorter reading is more accurate. And these studies are saying, not so fast. Which is why in any critical edition of the Greek New Testament, you have the textual reading and you have the footnotes with the other readings. Nothing's being hidden. When you produce a text that don't have those, then you are saying you need to read it as I read it. But when you do a really critical text, hey, the reader can look down there and go, there may have been people who prior to Nestle-Aland 28th, when they preached through Jude 5, said Jesus delivered a people from Egypt. And now that's what Nestle-Aland 28 says, because it was in the footnotes, had been for as far back as I've looked in the Nestle-Aland text. So this is important. This is important stuff in what is being said. Now here's the next interesting thing. I know we're geeking out here. We'll get to the phone calls, but this is just sort of giving you an idea of something that just happened while I was prepping for the show that turned out to be really interesting, and you're going to see why here. He then looks at the scribes of 319, and there were two scribes, 319A and 319B. 319A seemingly knew a little Greek. 319B didn't know Greek. Now, who do you think made the more accurate copy? The guy who didn't know Greek. Because all he's doing, it's similar to P75, where the scribe of P75 is copying letters. When you start copying words and you don't really have a good knowledge of the language, you can mess the words up. Because you think you know how it's supposed to go when that's not how it actually goes. And so there's another fascinating element. Scribes who were mechanically copying the text without knowing the original language that they're copying tended to be more accurate than people who actually had either a good or not so good knowledge of the text itself. Fascinating observation here, documented in the way that it is being examined. And then they even speculate on the idea that the patron, the person paying to have the copy made, gave instructions to the scribes as to how they wanted the copy to be made. And that whole element is rarely a part of a discussion of the manuscripts. And of course, we need to recognize there's a difference between the manuscript and the text or the witness of the manuscript, because the manuscript's a material thing from a particular time period. But you may be copying from a manuscript that's 250 years earlier. So the text within it may have been copied in such and such a century, but it represents the state of the text 2.5 centuries earlier, except as far as you make changes, accidental or otherwise. All of these really, really fascinating things. Farnes says, there are many avenues for further study. From this study, I would like to know more about the scribal habits of those copying a language with which they were unfamiliar, and if my hypothesis holds true that non-native scribes will actually copy the text more accurately most of the time, but will make rare but egregious nonsensical errors. Because if you make an error, it's probably not going to make any sense, because you don't know the original language, and you don't know you just did something absolutely impossible. The person who knows the language is less likely to make the whoop, I just made up a whole new word that, has no meaning at all type error. But the person who doesn't know can, make all sorts of silly errors.